Sometimes the most powerful moments happen when we least expect them. In a world where duty means standing perfectly still for hours, where discipline demands silence in the face of chaos, and where tradition requires emotional walls thicker than castle stones, what happens when the human heart breaks through? This is the story of how one elderly veteran's simple act of remembrance shattered the unbreakable composure of Britain's most disciplined soldiers. It's about the moment when protocol gave way to compassion, when military precision yielded to human connection, and when the guards who protect the crown discovered that sometimes the greatest honor comes not from following orders, but from following your heart. What you're about to read isn't just about soldiers breaking ranks. It's about the invisible threads that connect us all, the power of respect across generations, and the beautiful truth that beneath every uniform beats the heart of someone who understands sacrifice, loss, and the weight of service. This is the day the Royal Guards remembered they were human first, soldiers second. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of Buckingham Palace like a gentle shroud, carrying with it the whispers of countless ceremonies that had taken place on these very grounds. At precisely 6:30 a.m., the familiar sound of polished boots echoed through the courtyard as the Queen's Guard prepared for another day of their eternal watch. The red tunics were pressed to perfection, the bearskin hats sat with military precision, and each face wore the stoic expression that had become synonymous with British tradition. Among them stood Guardsman James Mitchell, a 24-year-old soldier from Yorkshire whose journey to this prestigious position had been anything but ordinary. His father had served in the Falklands, his grandfather in World War II, and now James carried forward a legacy of service that ran deeper than the Thames itself. But on this particular Tuesday morning in October, as autumn painted London in shades of gold and amber, James had no idea that his understanding of duty, honor, and humanity was about to be fundamentally changed. The changing of the guard ceremony was scheduled for 11 o'clock, as it had been for generations. Tourists were already gathering behind the iron gates, cameras ready, children perched on parents' shoulders, tour guides rehearsing their historical narratives. For most visitors, this was a spectacle, a photo opportunity, a chance to witness the pageantry that made Britain famous around the world. The guards had heard every possible comment, endured every attempted distraction, and maintained their composure through weather that ranged from blazing summer heat to bone-chilling winter winds. James took his position at the main gate, his rifle held at precisely the correct angle, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond the crowd that had gathered to watch. The morning routine was as familiar as breathing. Stand perfectly still, ignore all distractions, respond only to direct threats or official commands. These weren't just rules. They were sacred principles that had been drilled into every guardsman from their first day of training. The uniform they wore represented centuries of military excellence, and breaking character wasn't just unprofessional, it was unthinkable. The crowd began to thicken as the ceremony time approached. Families with excited children pointed and whispered. Teenagers tried increasingly ridiculous attempts to make the guards smile or react, and professional photographers positioned themselves for the perfect shot. James had seen it all before. The dancing, the silly faces, the shouted jokes, the attempts to startle them with sudden movements or loud noises. Each guardsman learned early in their service that maintaining composure wasn't just about discipline. It was about respect for the institution they represented and the traditions they protected. As the morning progressed, something unusual caught James's attention from the corner of his eye. An elderly man had separated himself from the main crowd and was standing quietly near the fence, not taking pictures or trying to get attention like the others. He wore a weathered brown jacket that had seen better days, and his white hair was neatly combed despite the morning breeze. What struck James most was the man's posture, straight-backed and proud, with the unmistakable bearing of someone who had once worn a uniform himself. The old man didn't seem interested in the spectacle that captivated everyone else. Instead, he stood in respectful silence, his hands clasped behind his back in a stance that any military person would immediately recognize. His eyes weren't focused on the guards or the ceremony preparations. They seemed to be looking through time itself, as if he could see something the rest of the crowd couldn't. Minutes ticked by with mechanical precision. The ceremony would begin soon, and the guards would perform their time-honored ritual with the same exactness that had characterized this tradition for generations. James maintained his position, but found his attention occasionally drifting to the quiet figure who stood apart from the chattering tourists. There was something deeply familiar about the man's demeanor, something that spoke to the part of James that understood what it meant to serve, to stand watch, to carry the weight of responsibility for something greater than oneself. The old man reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew something small. From James's position, it was impossible to see exactly what it was, but the careful way the man handled it suggested it was precious. He held it for a moment, his lips moving silently as if in prayer or remembrance, then slowly pinned it to his jacket lapel. Even from a distance, the small flash of metal caught the morning light, and James felt a stirring of recognition deep in his chest. Other tourists continued their chatter and jostling for better positions, oblivious to the quiet drama unfolding nearby. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves, asking when the guards would move, why they looked so serious, whether they were real soldiers or just actors in costumes. The questions that had been asked thousands of times before by thousands of different visitors, all seeking to understand the mystery of these silent sentinels who stood watch over one of the world's most famous palaces. But the elderly man asked no questions. He simply stood and waited and remembered. The way he positioned himself wasn't casual or tourist-like. It was deliberate, purposeful, as if he had come here for a specific reason that went far beyond sightseeing. His presence created a small island of solemnity in an ocean of casual curiosity, and though James couldn't have explained why, he found himself deeply moved by this stranger's quiet dignity. The clock tower chimed the half-hour, and the ceremonial preparations began in earnest. Guards moved with practiced precision, each step calculated and perfect, each movement part of a choreography that had been refined over decades. The crowd's excitement grew palpable, cameras began clicking more frequently, and the air buzzed with anticipation. Yet through it all, the old man remained still, his eyes now closed, his weathered hands gripping something unseen in his jacket pocket. James felt a weight in his chest that had nothing to do with his equipment or the morning's duties. Something about this moment, this man, this quiet presence amid the pageantry, was reaching through his professional training and touching something deeper. He had been taught to see threats and opportunities, to assess crowds and identify potential problems, but he had never been taught how to respond to the simple power of one person's private moment of honor. The final preparations were complete. The ceremony would begin any moment, and James would once again be part of a tradition that connected him to generations of soldiers who had stood in this very spot. But today felt different. Today, he sensed that he was about to witness something that would challenge everything he thought he knew about duty, service, and the true meaning of the uniform he wore with such pride. As the first notes of the ceremony began to echo across the courtyard, James Mitchell, guardsman of Her Majesty's forces, prepared himself not just for another day of duty, but for a moment that would forever change his understanding of what it truly meant to serve. The ceremony commenced with the precision of a Swiss timepiece, every movement choreographed to perfection. The band struck up the familiar martial tunes that had accompanied this ritual for generations, and the guards began their measured march across the courtyard. James moved with his unit, each step falling in perfect synchronization with his brothers in arms, their rifles glinting in the morning sun as they performed the ancient dance of military tradition. But even as his body executed the familiar routine with automatic precision, James's mind remained partially focused on the elderly gentleman who continued to stand in respectful silence. The man had not moved from his position, had not raised a camera or called out like so many others. Instead, he simply watched with the kind of attention that spoke of deep understanding, as if he recognized not just the spectacle, but the sacrifice and dedication it represented. As the guards took their new positions, James found himself stationed closer to where the old man stood. Now, only 15 feet separated them, and James could see more clearly the details that had caught his attention earlier. The man's jacket, while clean and well-maintained, bore the subtle signs of age and careful preservation. His posture remained military straight, but James could now detect the slight tremor in his hands that spoke of advanced years and perhaps old injuries that still made their presence known on damp London mornings. Most significantly, James could now clearly see what the man had pinned to his lapel. It was a medal, not the sort of commemorative trinket sold in tourist shops, but a genuine military decoration. The distinctive ribbon and the weathered bronze spoke of service in a conflict that had tested a generation's courage and resolve. Even from his position, James could make out enough detail to recognize it as a campaign medal, the kind awarded to those who had served in active combat zones during some of the most challenging periods in modern British military history. The old man's eyes met James's for just a moment, and, in that brief connection, entire conversations seemed to pass between them. The veteran's gaze held no expectation that the guard would break protocol or acknowledge him in any way. Instead, it conveyed a deep understanding of duty, of the weight of responsibility that came with wearing the uniform, of the commitment required to stand watch regardless of personal comfort or convenience. It was the look of someone who had stood his own watches in far more dangerous places than the relative safety of Buckingham Palace. James felt his breath catch slightly as he began to piece together the story written in the old man's bearing and appearance. The careful way he held himself despite obvious physical limitations, the precise positioning that maximized his view of the ceremony, while remaining respectfully distant, the quiet dignity with which he wore his medal, all of it spoke of someone who understood military service from the inside out, someone who had earned the right to witness this tradition not as a curious observer, but as a brother-in-arms separated only by decades and circumstances. The ceremony continued around them, tourists snapping photographs and children asking endless questions about the guard's tall hats and red uniforms. But in the small space between James and the veteran, a different kind of communication was taking place. It was subtle, almost invisible to anyone not trained to recognize the silent language of military respect, but it was as real and powerful as any spoken conversation. The old man slowly reached into his pocket again and withdrew a small photograph, edges worn soft from years of handling. He looked at it for a long moment, his lips moving in what might have been a prayer or simply the recitation of names too precious to forget. Then, he looked up at the palace, at the guards, at the ceremony unfolding before him, and James saw something that made his chest tighten with emotion. Tears had begun to trace silent paths down the veteran's weathered cheeks. Not tears of sadness, exactly, but something more complex, a mixture of pride, loss, remembrance, and perhaps gratitude. The tears of someone who had survived when others had not, who had carried the weight of that survival for decades, and who found in this moment of pageantry a connection to something larger than himself, a reminder that his service and that of his fallen comrades had meant something lasting and important. James felt his own eyes beginning to moisten, and he had to exert tremendous self-control to maintain his composure. This was not what his training had prepared him for. He had been taught to handle aggressive tourists, unexpected weather, even potential security threats, but no one had ever instructed him on how to respond to the sight of an old soldier quietly honoring his own service and remembering his lost friends while watching the next generation carry on the traditions he had helped to preserve. Other guards in the formation remained focused on their duties, and the crowd continued to enjoy the spectacle, but James found himself locked in this moment of profound recognition. He could see that the veteran was not seeking attention or acknowledgement. This was a deeply personal pilgrimage, a quiet moment of communion with memories and meanings that transcended the tourist attraction this ceremony had become for most observers. The photograph in the old man's hands appeared to show a group of young soldiers, their faces bright with the confidence and optimism of youth, their uniforms suggesting a time and place where the stakes had been far higher than ceremonial duty. James could only imagine the stories those faces could tell, the adventures they had shared, the challenges they had overcome together, and the price some of them might have paid for their service. As the ceremony reached its climax, with guards marching and bands playing with flawless precision, the veteran lifted his free hand in a subtle gesture that took James's breath away. It was not a wave or an attempt to get attention, but a slow, respectful salute, performed with the muscle memory of countless military occasions, executed with the quiet dignity of someone who understood exactly what it meant and why it mattered. The salute was held for precisely the correct duration, then lowered with the same careful precision with which it had been raised. The old man then pressed the photograph to his chest for a moment, over his heart, before carefully returning it to his pocket. He adjusted his medal one final time, ensuring it sat properly on his lapel, and then simply stood at attention, watching the guards with the appreciation of someone who knew firsthand the dedication their service required. James felt something fundamental shifting inside him as he witnessed this private ceremony within the public spectacle. This was not about tourism or tradition for its own sake. This was about the unbroken chain of service that connected every soldier who had ever worn a uniform in defense of something larger than himself. The old man represented not just his own service, but the service of every veteran who had stood watch, who had answered the call when their country needed them, who had carried the responsibility of protecting others even when it meant putting themselves at risk. The ceremony was drawing to its close, and soon the guards would return to their individual positions for the long hours of stationary duty that lay ahead. But James knew that this day would be different from all the others, marked forever by this encounter with a veteran whose quiet dignity had reminded him why the uniform he wore carried such weight and meaning. He was no longer just performing a duty. He was participating in a tradition that honored the sacrifice and service of generations of men and women who had answered their country's call. As the formal portion of the ceremony concluded and the guards began to take their final positions, James caught the veteran's eye one more time. In that moment, he made a decision that would go against every regulation he had been taught, every principle of military bearing he had been trained to uphold. But it was also a decision that honored something deeper than regulations, something that connected him to the true spirit of service that the old soldier represented. Time seemed to slow as James took his position for the afternoon watch. The formal ceremony had concluded, and most of the crowd had begun to disperse, satisfied with their photographs and their brush with British tradition. But the elderly veteran remained, now standing even closer to the fence, his weathered hands gripping the iron bars with a gentleness that spoke of deep respect for everything they represented. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courtyard, and James could see more clearly now the full extent of what the old man wore. Beside the campaign medal on his lapel, a small regimental badge caught the light, and James felt his heart skip a beat as he recognized the insignia. It was the same regiment his own grandfather had served in during the Korean War, a connection that seemed to bridge the decades and create an invisible thread between past and present, between the young guard standing at attention and the old soldier remembering his fallen comrades. Other tourists continued to pass by, their attention span satisfied, their holiday schedules calling them to other attractions. But the veteran seemed to exist in a different time zone, his focus entirely absorbed by memories that James could only imagine. Occasionally, the old man would touch his medal, or his lips would move as if speaking to people who were no longer there but who lived on in his heart with an intensity that made them more real than the bustling city around him. James had been standing at his post for nearly an hour when something extraordinary happened. The veteran, who had been looking at the guards with quiet appreciation, suddenly straightened even further, his military bearing becoming more pronounced. He reached into his inner jacket pocket and withdrew not the photograph this time, but a small piece of paper, carefully folded and obviously treasured. His hands shook slightly as he unfolded it, and James could see that whatever was written there had been read many times before, the paper soft with handling. The old man began to read silently, his lips forming words that only he could hear. But, as he read, his emotional control, which had been so carefully maintained throughout the morning, began to falter. His shoulders shook slightly, and the tears that had been quietly present earlier now flowed more freely down his cheeks. Yet he continued to read, as if this was a ritual he had performed many times before, a necessary conversation with the past that could not be avoided or postponed. James found his own composure beginning to crack as he watched this display of private grief and remembrance. Every instinct in his military training told him to remain focused on his duties, to ignore distractions, to maintain the professional distance that was essential to his role. But something deeper than training was stirring in his chest, something that recognized in this old soldier's pain the human cost of all the ceremonies and traditions that James had been taught to protect. The veteran finished reading and carefully refolded the paper, returning it to his pocket with the reverence of someone handling a sacred relic. Then, he did something that shattered James's remaining ability to maintain emotional distance. The old man removed his cap, revealing a head of white hair that had once been covered by a military beret, and placed it over his heart. He then began to recite something under his breath, words that James couldn't hear, but could see in the movement of the veteran's lips. It was the Lord's Prayer, followed by what appeared to be names, a litany of fallen comrades being remembered and honored by the survivor, who carried their memory forward into a world that had largely forgotten their sacrifice. Each name seemed to cost the old man something, as if speaking them aloud brought back not just memories, but the full weight of loss that he had carried for decades. James felt his own eyes filling with tears, and, for the first time in his career as a guard, he found himself struggling to maintain his composure. This was not just a tourist attraction or a photo opportunity. This was a sacred moment, a private communion between a veteran and his past that was taking place in the shadow of the very institutions he had once served to protect. Other guards in the formation remained focused on their duties, their training intact, their professional bearing unmarked by the drama unfolding just meters away. But James felt as if he was witnessing something that transcended duty and regulation, something that spoke to the very heart of why soldiers served in the first place. The old man's tears were not just his own. They represented the grief of every military family who had lost someone, every veteran who had survivor's guilt, every person who had paid the price for others' freedom. As the veteran concluded his private ceremony, he slowly replaced his cap and stood at attention one final time. His salute this time was different from the earlier one, more formal, more complete, held longer as if he was saying goodbye not just to the guards but to something within himself. It was the salute of someone who had found a way to honor his fallen friends while also acknowledging that his own time for such visits might be drawing to a close. James felt something snap inside his chest. All the regulations, all the training, all the emphasis on maintaining professional distance seemed suddenly insignificant compared to the simple human need to acknowledge this old soldier's service and sacrifice. The veteran was not seeking attention or recognition. He was simply fulfilling a promise made long ago to remember those who could no longer remember themselves. The decision that James made in that moment was not calculated or planned. It came from somewhere deeper than his military training, from the part of him that understood that some moments transcended rules and regulations. Moving almost without conscious thought, James slowly brought his rifle to present arms, the formal salute reserved for high-ranking officials and ceremonial occasions. The movement was subtle enough that most casual observers would not have noticed, but unmistakable to anyone with military experience. It was a breach of protocol that could result in disciplinary action, a break in character that went against everything James had been trained to do. But it was also a recognition of warrior to warrior, acknowledgement of service that crossed generational lines, and honored the unbroken chain of sacrifice that connected all soldiers throughout history. The veteran's reaction was immediate and profound. His eyes widened as he recognized what was happening, and for a moment he seemed unable to believe that this young guard was actually acknowledging his presence, his service, his private moment of remembrance. Then, slowly, a smile broke across his weathered face, not the casual pleasure of a tourist whose photo was being taken, but the deep gratitude of someone whose sacrifice had finally been seen and honored by the next generation. Other guards in the formation had begun to notice what was happening. Guardsman Thompson, standing 20 feet away, caught sight of James's raised rifle and felt his own chest tighten as he realized what his colleague was doing. The veteran's emotional state was now visible to anyone who cared to look, and Thompson found himself facing the same internal struggle that had just consumed James. The moment stretched between them, old soldier and young guard, connected across the decades by their shared understanding of duty, service, and the price that such commitments exact from those who make them. James held the salute longer than regulation demanded, making it clear that this was not an accident or a mistake, but a deliberate act of recognition and respect. When he finally lowered his rifle, James saw that the veteran's tears had returned, but these were different tears, tears of gratitude and recognition, tears that spoke to the healing power of having one's service acknowledged by someone who understood its weight and meaning. The old man mouthed the words, "Thank you," and slowly raised his own hand in response. Not quite a salute, but a gesture of acknowledgement that spoke volumes about the connection that had been forged in this unexpected moment. But the breaking of protocol had been noticed by more than just other guards. In the crowd, people had begun to point and whisper, sensing that something unusual was happening but not quite understanding its significance. And somewhere in the administrative buildings surrounding the palace, security cameras had recorded every moment of the interaction, creating a permanent record of the day when a royal guard chose humanity over regulation, when the heart proved stronger than the handbook. What happened next transformed a single moment of individual recognition into something far more powerful and widespread. Guardsman Thompson, who had witnessed James's salute to the veteran, found himself caught in the same emotional undertow that had swept his colleague beyond the boundaries of regulation and protocol. The sight of the old soldier's tears of gratitude, combined with his own growing understanding of what he was witnessing, created a pressure in Thompson's chest that seemed to demand release. Thompson had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before joining the Queen's Guard, and he recognized in the veterans bearing the unmistakable signs of someone who had seen combat, who had lost friends, who had carried the weight of service long after the uniform had been hung up for the final time. The formal training that had taught Thompson to remain impassive in the face of any distraction suddenly seemed inadequate when confronted with this level of authentic human emotion and sacrifice. As Thompson wrestled with his own response, other guards in the formation were becoming aware of the situation unfolding near the main gate. Guardsman Williams, a recent addition to the regiment whose father had served in the Falklands War, caught sight of the veteran's medal and felt his own family history stirring within him. The stories his father had shared about brotherhood, loss, and the bonds forged in military service suddenly took on new meaning as he watched this old soldier honor his own memories with such dignity and grace. The veteran, still overwhelmed by James's unexpected acknowledgement, had begun to move slowly along the fence line, his gait revealing the lingering effects of old injuries and the natural limitations of advanced age. But his military bearing remained intact, and, as he walked, he continued to touch his medal, to nod respectfully at each guard he passed, his eyes still bright with unshed tears of gratitude and remembrance. It was then that Thompson made his own decision to honor something greater than regulation. As the veteran passed his position, Thompson executed a subtle but unmistakable movement, a slight bow of his head, a gesture of respect that acknowledged the old soldier's service while maintaining the appearance of normal guard duty to casual observers. The veteran noticed immediately, and his smile deepened as he realized that what had begun with one guard's recognition was spreading through the ranks like a quiet revolution of respect. Williams watched this exchange with growing emotion, and when the veteran reached his section of the formation, he too found himself unable to maintain the stoic indifference that protocol demanded. In a movement so slight that only someone watching specifically for it would have noticed, Williams adjusted his grip on his rifle in a way that created a brief, formal gesture of acknowledgement. It was not quite a salute, but it was clearly intentional, a recognition of warrior to warrior that transcended the boundaries of time and circumstance. The veteran's progress along the fence line was becoming a journey of unexpected connection. Each guard who acknowledged him, whether through a subtle nod, a slight adjustment of posture, or a momentary shift in attention, added another layer to an experience that was transforming from a private moment of remembrance into a collective recognition of service and sacrifice that bridged generations. But the guards were not the only ones beginning to notice what was happening. Among the tourists and casual observers, some individuals with military backgrounds or family connections to the armed forces were recognizing the significance of the veteran's bearing and the guard's subtle responses. A middle-aged woman whose brother had served in Iraq found herself moved to tears as she watched the old soldier's dignified progress and the respectful acknowledgement he was receiving from the young guards. An American veteran visiting London with his family noticed the campaign medal on the old man's jacket and felt his own military experience resonate with what he was witnessing. Without fully understanding the breach of protocol that was occurring, he sensed that something important was happening, something that spoke to values and connections that transcended national boundaries and institutional rules. The ripple effect was expanding beyond the immediate participants as word began to spread through the crowd about the emotional drama unfolding between the guards and the veteran. People began to pay closer attention, to notice the tears on the old man's face and the subtle but unmistakable signs of respect he was receiving from soldiers who were supposed to remain completely impassive. A young girl, perhaps 8 years old, tugged at her mother's sleeve and asked in a voice that carried clearly in the afternoon air, "Mummy, why is the old man crying? And why are the soldiers looking at him differently?" Her question, innocent and direct, seemed to crystallize what many in the crowd were beginning to sense, that they were witnessing something extraordinary, something that went beyond the usual tourist spectacle to touch on deeper truths about honor, memory, and the connections that bind people together across the years. The veteran, now perhaps halfway through his journey along the fence line, paused near a section where 3 guards were positioned close together. The weight of the acknowledgement he had received seemed to overwhelm him momentarily, and he leaned against the fence for support, his breathing labored with emotion rather than physical exertion. It was clear that this experience was affecting him as profoundly as it was affecting the guards who were breaking protocol to honor him. For a moment, It seemed as if the veteran might be unable to continue, overcome by the unexpected recognition of his service and sacrifice. But then, drawing on reserves of strength that had sustained him through decades of carrying his memories, he straightened once more and continued his progress. Each step seemed to carry new meaning, as if he was walking not just past a line of guards but through his own history, seeing his service reflected and honored in the faces of young soldiers who understood the weight of the uniform they wore. The guards who had already acknowledged the veteran found themselves continuing to watch his progress with personal investment in his experience. James, who had initiated the chain of recognition, felt a profound sense of rightness about what was happening, despite knowing that he would likely face disciplinary action for his breach of protocol. The regulations that had seemed so important an hour earlier now felt secondary to the human truth of what was unfolding before him. As the veteran approached the final section of guards near the corner of the formation, the emotional intensity of the situation had reached a level that was affecting everyone involved. The old soldier's tears continued to flow, but they were now clearly tears of gratitude and connection rather than grief and loneliness. The recognition he had received from these young guards had transformed his private moment of remembrance into something shared and honored, giving him perhaps the first sense in years that his service and the service of his fallen comrades still mattered to someone. The crowd had grown quieter as more people became aware that something significant was happening. Even those without military experience could sense the emotional weight of the moment, the way the usual boundaries between performer and audience, guard and civilian, had dissolved into something more human and authentic. Cameras that had been clicking constantly during the formal ceremony were now held respectfully silent, as people seemed to instinctively understand that this was not a moment for casual photography, but for witnessing and respect. What none of the participants knew was that this spontaneous display of cross-generational military respect was being observed by individuals whose response would determine whether the guard's breach of protocol would result in punishment or recognition. In the administrative offices overlooking the courtyard, senior officers who had been reviewing the security footage of the day's ceremonies were witnessing something that challenged their own understanding of duty, regulation, and the deeper purposes that military tradition was meant to serve. Colonel Patricia Hartwell had served 32 years in the British Army, rising through the ranks with a combination of tactical brilliance and unwavering dedication to military excellence. As the commanding officer responsible for the Queen's Guard, she had seen every possible breach of protocol, every imaginable distraction, and every conceivable challenge to the discipline that made these soldiers among the most respected in the world. But, as she watched the security footage of the afternoon's events, she found herself confronting something entirely outside her experience. The video clearly showed the sequence of events that had unfolded near the main gate. The elderly veteran's emotional tribute to his fallen comrades, James's deliberate salute in response, and the subsequent ripple of recognition that had spread through the formation were all documented with crystal clarity. By every standard measure of military discipline, what had occurred was a serious breach of protocol that demanded swift corrective action. The guards had broken character, violated their standing orders, and allowed personal emotion to override their professional responsibilities. But Colonel Hartwell found herself unable to view the incident through the lens of regulation alone. Her own father had been a veteran of the Second World War, and she had grown up with stories of the bonds forged between soldiers, the weight of survivors' guilt, and the importance of honoring those who had paid the ultimate price for their service. As she watched the footage repeatedly, she began to see not a discipline problem, but a profound expression of the very values that military service was meant to protect and preserve. The veteran had completed his journey along the fence line, and the footage showed him pausing at the corner of the formation, visibly struggling with the emotional impact of the recognition he had received. Several guards in the final section had offered their own subtle acknowledgments, and the old soldier seemed overwhelmed by the cumulative effect of having his service honored by an entire generation of young warriors who understood the significance of what he represented. In the final frames of the relevant footage, the veteran could be seen slowly removing his medal from his jacket and holding it up toward the guards, not in a gesture of display, but in a moment of profound connection. It was as if he was sharing not just the physical symbol of his service, but the memories and meaning it carried, offering it to these young soldiers as a bridge between past and present, between his generation's sacrifice and their ongoing commitment to the same ideals. Colonel Hartwell paused the video and leaned back in her chair, weighing the decision that would determine the fate of the guards involved. The regulations were clear, and maintaining discipline was essential to the integrity of the entire institution. But she also understood that military service was about more than following rules. It was about upholding values, honoring sacrifice, and maintaining the human connections that gave meaning to the uniform and purpose to the duty. A knock on her door interrupted her deliberation. Sergeant Major Richardson, a veteran of multiple deployments whose respect for protocol was matched only by his understanding of what motivated soldiers at the deepest level, entered with a solemn expression that suggested he too had reviewed the afternoon's events. "Colonel, I've spoken with the guards involved," Richardson reported, his voice carefully neutral. Guardsman Mitchell acknowledges that he initiated the breach of protocol. He's prepared to accept whatever disciplinary action you deem appropriate. The others have similarly accepted responsibility for their actions. Colonel Hartwell studied Richardson's face, reading the subtext in his measured words. "And what's your assessment, Sergeant Major? What would you recommend?" Richardson was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with his own response to the situation. "Ma'am, in 28 years of service, I've never seen anything quite like what happened today. Those guards broke protocol, yes, but they also honored something that goes to the very heart of why we serve. That veteran, he served with the Gloucestershire Regiment in Korea, according to the research I was able to do. Lost most of his unit in action. Been coming to these ceremonies for years, apparently, but never created any disruption, never sought attention." The sergeant major paused, then continued with obvious emotion in his voice. "Ma'am, I believe those guards saw something today that reminded them why they wear the uniform. Sometimes the most important duty isn't following the letter of the regulation, but honoring the spirit that the regulation was meant to protect." Colonel Hartwell nodded slowly, understanding the weight of the decision before her. The easy choice would be to enforce the regulations strictly, to discipline the guards, and send a clear message about the importance of maintaining protocol regardless of circumstances. But the deeper choice, the one that acknowledged the full complexity of military service and its human dimensions, required something more nuanced. "Sergeant Major, I want you to arrange for me to meet with Guardsman Mitchell and the others involved. But first, I want to speak with that veteran if he's willing. I believe there's more to this story than what we can see in the footage." 2 hours later, Colonel Hartwell found herself sitting across from Harold Winston, the 87-year-old Korean War veteran whose private moment of remembrance had triggered the day's extraordinary events. Winston had been located through the Veterans Affairs Office, and despite his initial nervousness about meeting with a senior officer, he had agreed to come to the palace to discuss what had occurred. Winston's story, as it emerged over the course of their conversation, was both heartbreaking and inspiring. He had indeed served with the Gloucestershire Regiment during some of the most brutal fighting of the Korean War, losing 17 members of his unit during a single engagement that had left him physically wounded and emotionally scarred. For decades, he had struggled with survivor's guilt and the weight of carrying forward the memories of young men whose lives had been cut short in service to their country. "I come to the ceremonies several times a year," Winston explained, his voice still strong despite his age. "It helps me feel connected to something larger than my own grief. Today was the anniversary of the battle where we lost so many good lads. I brought their photograph, said their names, tried to honor them in the only way I know how." He paused, his eyes growing moist as he relived the afternoon's events. "When that young guardsman acknowledged me, when he showed that level of respect, it was the first time in decades that I felt like someone understood what we went through, what we lost, why it still matters. Those other guards who followed his lead, they gave me something I didn't even know I was looking for." Colonel Hartwell listened to Winston's story with growing certainty about the decision she needed to make. This was not a simple matter of discipline or protocol. It was about the fundamental purpose of military service and the connections that bound together all those who had answered their country's call. When she met with the guards later that evening, Colonel Hartwell found herself facing a group of young soldiers who clearly expected to be disciplined for their actions. James Mitchell stood at attention, his bearing perfect despite the obvious tension in his posture. The others flanked him, equally prepared to accept the consequences of their decision to honor the veteran's service above strict adherence to regulation. "Gentlemen," Colonel Hartwell began, her voice carrying the authority of decades of command, "what you did today was unprecedented in the history of the Queen's Guard. You broke protocol, violated your standing orders, and allowed personal emotion to influence your professional duty." The guards remained at attention, but James felt his heart sink as the expected reprimand began. He had known the consequences when he made his decision, but hearing them articulated by his commanding officer made the reality of his situation unavoidable. However, the colonel continued, and something in her tone caused all the guards to focus more intently on her words. After reviewing the circumstances and speaking with Mr. Winston, I have concluded that what you did today represents the highest traditions of military service. You recognized a fellow warrior, honored his sacrifice, and demonstrated that the true meaning of duty extends beyond regulations to encompass the human values that give those regulations their purpose. The silence in the room was profound as the guards struggled to process what they were hearing. James felt a surge of disbelief followed by overwhelming relief as the colonel's words sank in. Rather than disciplinary action, Colonel Hartwell announced, "I am recommending all of you for commendation. Your actions today reminded everyone who witnessed them why we serve and whom we serve for. You honored not just Mr. Winston, but every veteran who has ever worn the uniform. And you demonstrated that true military bearing includes the courage to recognize and respect the sacrifice of others." The meeting concluded with arrangements for a formal ceremony where Mr. Winston would be invited back to the palace, this time as an honored guest rather than a distant observer. The guards who had acknowledged him would be publicly recognized for their demonstration of the values that military service was meant to embody, and the entire incident would be recorded not as a breach of discipline but as an example of how regulations and humanity could work together to achieve something greater than either could accomplish alone. In the weeks that followed, word of the incident spread throughout the military community and beyond. The story of the guards who broke character to honor a veteran became a symbol of the connections that bind together all those who serve, regardless of when or where their service took place. Mr. Winston, who had spent decades carrying his memories in solitude, found himself embraced by a community of veterans and active duty soldiers who understood the weight of his experience and the importance of ensuring that such sacrifices were never forgotten. For James Mitchell and his fellow guards, the incident marked a turning point in their understanding of what it meant to wear the uniform. They had learned that true discipline sometimes required the courage to look beyond regulations to the deeper purposes those regulations were meant to serve. And they had discovered that the most powerful moments of their service might come not from following orders, but from recognizing the humanity in others and having the courage to act on that recognition. The morning after the formal ceremony honoring Mr. Winston, James took his position at the main gate with a deeper understanding of the weight and meaning of his duty. The tourists and photographers were there as always, seeking their glimpse of British pageantry and tradition. But James now knew that sometimes the most important moments happened in the spaces between the formal ceremonies, in the quiet encounters between people who shared a common understanding of service, sacrifice, and the enduring bonds that connect all those who have answered the call to serve something greater than themselves.